So today I want to talk about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. If you've not heard, the United States has recommended putting a pause on the administration of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, at least temporarily, due to it causing blood clots in people. The CDC and FDA have put out a statement, which I hope to share and read within the course of this video, as well as give my analysis on. I also want to spend some time talking about the social factors of why they probably did this, as well as talk about the groups of people involved, and have a brief discussion about how sometimes medications like vaccines affect groups of people that we don't always expect or foresee. So before anything else, I need to give this disclaimer more than any other. This is not medical advice. If you are concerned, it is much better you go talk to your doctor and sort things out that way, because I cannot and will not give medical advice in this video. Further, I want to make my position absolutely clear. This is not an anti-vax position. I am pro-vaccination, and therefore this will be one where I talk about the importance of vaccines of this kind. As a matter of fact, I do not believe that we would be talking about this quite the same way if we did not already have two other viable vaccines in the United States, namely Moderna and Pfizer. I don't believe that Johnson & Johnson, being the only vaccine available, would have been paused in the way that it has. And it would still probably create better outcomes if we didn't pause this in the long run as the only vaccine, due to the fact that COVID, being left to run rampant, would create a much worse scenario for the country. The variety of vaccines in this case is what's giving us the luxury of being able to halt this and to take a moment and reevaluate and pause things, especially as this is not the only vector vaccine in the world that is currently affecting people with blood clots right now, because we are fully aware of the fact that the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not approved in the US but is approved throughout most of Europe, has caused similar blood clots from similar conditions. So with that said, I want to take some time and read the CDC and FDA statement and give my analysis on it. So the joint CDC and FDA statement on the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine, which was released on April 13, 2021, reads as followed. As of April 12th, more than 6.8 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine have been administered in the United States. CDC and FDA are reviewing data involving 6 reported U.S. cases of a rare and severe type of blood clot in individuals after receiving the J&J vaccine. In these cases, a type of blood clot called cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, CVST, was seen in combination with low levels of blood platelets. All 6 cases occurred among women between the ages of 18 and 48, and symptoms occurred between 6 and 13 days after vaccination. Treatment of this specific type of blood clot is different from the treatment that might typically be administered. Usually the anticoagulant drug called heparin is used to treat blood clots. In this setting, the administration of heparin may be dangerous, and therefore alternative treatments need to be given. So that's like the key thing to start off with here, and why they probably started this process of putting this all on pause. Because heparin is usually administered. It's a anticoagulant. It kind of thins out parts of the blood in kind of a minor way of putting it, and it allows for blood clots to be treated. But in this case, they are noting that heparin might be dangerous for people, so they need to take the time to figure out and tell doctors and medical staff and nurses what they might need in order to properly deal with these types of situations. So what to look out for, how to handle it, what medications they might give instead, and make sure that people who might be giving out these vaccines when it starts to be administered again, basically just figure out ways in which they can hand out this medication in a safer fashion, so that if somebody reports a symptom within that span of 6 to 13 days, they are able to address it, and they're able to go get people the medications that they need. So the CDC will convene a meeting of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, on Wednesday to further review these cases and assess the potential significance. The FDA will review that analysis as it also investigates that case. Until that process is complete, we are recommending a pause in the use of the vaccine out of an abundance of caution. This is important in part to ensure the healthcare provider community is aware of the potential for these adverse effects and can plan proper recognition and management due to the unique treatment required with this type of blood clot. So that's basically what I was just explaining, how essentially because it's a different way of dealing with blood clots than what they're used to dealing with, you need to have this basically handled in a more, unique way where we're able to have a conversation about like going to the patient and saying, hey, you have a blood clot. Have you taken this particular vaccine recently? Is that, you're changing a bit of the medical paradigm and discourse rather than just throwing heparin at people who might have a blood clot, because that can cause long-term effects. And that's important. That might save a few lives and that might change the dynamic in a few cases. So right now, these adverse effects appear to be extremely rare. COVID-19 vaccine safety is top priority for the federal government, and we take all reports of health problems following COVID-19 vaccination very seriously. People who have received the vaccine who develop severe headache, abdominal pain, leg pain, shortness of breath within 3 weeks after vaccination should contact the healthcare provider that they have. Healthcare providers are asked to report any of these adverse effects to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And then there was reports that the CDC and FDA would be having a media briefing online. So they basically ended up coming out and saying that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine would only be out of use for a few days to figure out exactly what's going on. But the hypothesis for what is happening, though we don't know exactly what it is for sure, is that this is some sort of immune response that's triggering the platelets to clot. Further, I think this is really important to take into account the fact that AstraZeneca, the other vector vaccine from Europe, has been having very similar symptoms. The mechanisms for these two vaccines, both being vector vaccines, are similar enough, even though they're different forms. And it is probably worth taking a step back when both of them are causing the same type of rare disease combination, namely that of the low platelets and the specific clotting that is occurring. It's also worth noting that these issues seem to be way more common in the AstraZeneca vaccine than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Now, I also want to point out that the Sputnik vaccine that is available in Russia is also a vector vaccine. So it might be worth taking some time to figure out whether or not blood clots is an issue in that particular vaccine, and that perhaps this is somehow tied to vector vaccines as a whole, so that we can figure out which populations might be best off getting which type of vaccine. Perhaps if this is only affecting a certain subgroup of the population, then we could offer that subgroup Moderna or Pfizer BioNTech rather than giving them the Johnson & Johnson, Sputnik, or AstraZeneca. So this is really about trying to figure out the best course of action to save as many lives as possible. But that said, I think we need to take some time to actually talk about who this is actually affecting and what the risks are involved. So let's take a look at some more information involved in all of that. So as of Monday, April 12th, about 6.8 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine had been given. There's only been 6 cases in that time span. So we're talking about 1 in a million. That's 1 in a million people who are getting this rare thing, where they're getting these blood clots. And given all of that, compared to the fact that 1 in 600 Americans have died from COVID, Never mind the amount that have gotten it and might have long-term adverse effects. This 1 in a million is completely reasonable in terms of the society to give this vaccine. Now, that's why I said that if we didn't have Moderna and we didn't have Pfizer, that it's very likely that we would not have stopped the continued usage of this particular vaccine, because it's not affecting a lot of people at all. However, it is worth noting that all 6 people that were hit were younger women whose potential risk from COVID-19 would have been much lower. The women were between the ages of 18 and 48, and they did develop serious blood clots within 6 to 13 days after getting the vaccine. So, can we specifically say that it's tied to women or that it's tied to this particular age group? Not really. The unfortunate reality is 6 people is substantial enough to recognize the problems occurring, but it may not be substantial enough to kind of process who exactly is involved, what the risk factors are involved. This sample set is really small, and we might need to look at more cases of it before we truly know what's going on. Now, I do need to point out that the AstraZeneca situation is not exclusively happening to women, and again, is happening in much higher amounts. So while both vector vaccines can possibly inform one another, it's also possible that there is a different mechanism or trigger, or that it might be affecting more people in one vaccine versus the other. And the fact is, we don't know. And while we could assume that this is something that's affecting women, it's a little premature. But I can't really say for sure. There's been no studies done on it. At this point, everything I'm saying is guesswork, and it really isn't going to benefit us in the long run by guessing without actual trials. The unfortunate reality is when we do trials, we put people at risk, especially in these types of vaccines. Ideally, we would have liked to have seen this vaccine tested for 10 years in clinical trials with all sorts of, backing and to create the gold standard. But we don't have the luxury of that in this climate while we're dealing with the initial spread of a virus that could cause serious long-term consequences within human bodies. So, one thing I will note in just all of this is that subgroups of, the human population do often have very anomalous results from time to time that don't seem to have any sort of correlation or reason for it. And as a matter of fact, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is one such that had a correlation, where there was a situation where Native American populations, American Indian and Alaskan Native populations, were about 2.1 times more likely to get COVID after receiving the vaccine. And this was statistically shown to not be an anomaly. Basically, this had a true value, and we don't know the reason for this. But again, based on relative risk factors, American Indian and Alaskan Native populations, compared to all other people groups out there who received the vaccine in a sample set, ended up getting higher amounts of the virus after getting the vaccine. Now, it's not like it increased it, just they had a higher proportionate rate to the rest of the population. And the reason for that is unknown. And so a lot of people in indigenous communities in the United States were saying that they, in particular, did not want the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And that's kind of a reasonable claim to make, especially if you are within these populations that maybe you won't have the same efficacy as other populations. And that's something to note and to consider, that this is something that we're going to have to adapt and work with as we go. That's the unfortunate position that we are put in based on everything else. I think it's also useful to remember that when we deal with these vaccines and medicines, again, we are not in the place that we'd like to be. But that said, let's talk about the social implications of putting all of this on pause. So by putting this on pause, there's been some fear factors within the medical community. Namely, that since scores of vaccine appointments were canceled this week, what might that do to certain populations? Some people who were really excited or really enthusiastic about getting the vaccine, maybe some of them would be turned off to it. That fear might end up fueling people to enter into vaccine hesitancy by trying to think that, oh, since the Johnson & Johnson one might be a problem, that it might extend to Moderna and Pfizer. And further, we have the issue of conspiracy theorists, where people who are anti-vax might come out and say, see, this is proof and evidence that vaccines don't work and they cause harm too. As if the 1 in a million case somehow outweighs the 1 in 600 people who have died from COVID. But naturally, there will be people who do that. However, the CDC and FDA, in combination with other health risk communication experts, basically realized that it's actually worse to ignore it. That by challenging this and by putting it out there, they are being as forthcoming with the potential side effects as possible, and that people who might otherwise decide against vaccination from hearing stories might work within the system and populations. Unfortunately, we don't know which direction the US population will go with this, but it is hoped that they will make the right decision and that this Johnson & Johnson thing doesn't end up hurting vaccination in the long run. I personally don't think it will. I think it'll end up just being a blip and that they'll figure out the causes. They'll be able to tell people what's going on, and nurses and doctors and medical professionals will be able to just be prepared for the symptoms, and that honestly Johnson & Johnson will probably continue to be administered. That said, I do have to admit that for myself, I'm probably going to be getting Moderna. And that was partly coincidence, and honestly, part of me didn't want to take the risk on the blood clots as I was hearing about it. And I'm actually glad and feel more safe and secure personally that they're addressing it and talking about it, especially since it seems to be affecting certain populations more than others. And it's just nice to know that they're taking it seriously. And this is coming from someone who acknowledges all of this and is not anti-vax in any way. So with all of that said, I'm genuinely glad they paused the vaccine and they're providing transparency with all this. The need to alert medical staff in combination with the blood clots and the similarities to the rare symptoms with AstraZeneca, with the social conditions in the United States, have created a scenario where it's probably better off that they took a few moments, paused, and used the fact that they have alternative vaccines available to create a better scenario, because the conditions are as they are, and we have the luxury to pause this vaccine. Again, we don't know the full story, and even if this is generally safe, which I believe it is, it's better to be safer than sorrier. And waiting a few days isn't going to make a grand difference in any of the distribution. So with that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Terra, and I thank you for watching.